A couple months back, I had to deal with a pretty substantial basement flood, and it was a big headache. It took a lot of time and quite a bit of money. And I want to go through the step-by-step process of dealing with this flood, and whether it be fixing the damage itself or dealing with the insurance company that you would think would pay for the damage, which isn't always the case. We'll go over that in this video. But in order to deal with fixing water damage, you have to have water damage in the first place. So let's start there. So back at the very end of July of 2021, I bought this property that I'm filming from right now. This is actually the very basement that will be the topic of discussion. But I bought this property as a primary residence, and it's eventually going to be a rental once we move out of it in about half a year's time from the filming of this video. We were going to turn our old primary residence into a rental and keep building that portfolio, so everything was looking great. We closed at the end of July on this place and then proceeded to move in a couple weeks later. The property itself is a 3-story townhome in Chicago, and in this case, even though we have shared walls with the units next to us, we actually own the plot of land, so it's not as though this is a condo association where there's some board that we have to sort of appease or report to. It is our own land and it's kind of our own domain. And that goes for just about all of the piping on this property as well, but we'll get back to that. But anyways, within just 2 weeks of moving into the property, before we had even unpacked everything, the city of Chicago had a very tremendous storm. We're talking about 4 inches of rain or so in just about an hour. Now this house does have a sump pump, and the way a sump pump works is that it basically takes the water from around the house and collects it and then sends it through your sewer line or something to actually send it back into the main drainage system. So it gets it away from the house rather than allowing it to pool up next to the house or damage the foundation or come up through the foundation even if the water table's high enough. It just tries to keep the water away from the sides of the house as the water pools next to it. And our sump pump, which is actually relatively new, was working in this case. It was taking all of the water, collecting it, and sending it through our sewer system as it always does. But there still was quite a lot of rain and, more importantly, storm surge. So even though there might have been 4 inches for every one spot falling onto the ground in Chicago, there might have been a lot more in particular areas where the water is flowing towards, because the water has to go somewhere. It's trying to find the lowest point in the city, I suppose. And that lowest area often happens to be a storm drain or something like that, at least in an urban area. But either way, our sump pump appeared to be doing its job. But in the middle of the storm, all of a sudden, I heard my wife cry out, "Jack, there's water in the basement!" I didn't really know what to expect because this property hadn't had major flood issues in the past, at least that we knew of. So when I went downstairs, I was very surprised to see about 1 inch of water across the entire basement floor and tons of water pouring in through the basement window. Now, unfortunately, I was a little bit too busy to film myself actually catching all of this water coming through the window. Plenty of it was already on the ground, so the damage was as good as done, but we were stopping as much of the extra water from coming in as we could. I probably caught a few gallons of water just pouring in through the window. And we're not talking about clean water here. It's water that's been through dirt, and as we found out later, it came in through our sewer line. You see, our sewer line is actually right next to one of our basement windows, the window where all of the water came through. So a lot of the water that the sump pump was pushing through the sewer line was coming right back next to the window and was pooling up, in addition to all of the storm surge and everything else, to where the water line essentially rose to about 1/3 of the way up our basement window and just started pouring in from there. Thankfully, the flow of water did stop within about 15 minutes of us discovering the issue, so it could have been a lot worse, I suppose, but that's when we got to the remediation stage. Now the water flow did stop, but we had all this water in the basement to take care of, and that took quite a few hours just to try and clean it up. I didn't have a wet vac or anything like that, so my wife actually went out to try and grab one from a relative, and the one that she brought back actually didn't even work. So we basically were trying to clean up a bunch of water in the basement using towels and kind of sweeping it towards our drain that we have in the basement. We also had a massive rug in the middle of the room that soaked up a ton of water, and it was super difficult to try and dry. Our basement was finished and it had vinyl tile. And one good thing about vinyl tile is that it's relatively waterproof. But a bad thing is that once water gets underneath the vinyl tile, there's really nowhere for it to go, and it just sits there and starts to rot essentially. But we did pretty much everything we could have done that night with relatively limited resources. We put some fans on it overnight, but really nothing that would have helped that much in the grand scheme of things. And the next day I contacted my insurance agent and told them what happened, that we had this damage and we're gonna need to get things things remediated and figure out what to do next. They put me in contact with a water remediation company, and that company actually was able to schedule me just 2 days later, which in hindsight was actually a pretty big deal because they were very busy because of this storm affecting all different parts of the city, and there was a lot of substantial flood damage. But just a few days after the actual flood occurred, they stopped by and figured out what they needed to do. They did water readings to see where things were wet and what things were dry. Anything that was still wet at this point was a potential hazard. When you have water, especially dirty water coming from outside, inside of a building, that's what causes mold to form and all sorts of nasty things. By this point, the room was really starting to smell pretty bad. So any areas that were still wet, they proceeded to rip up. They ripped up all of the vinyl floor. They cut out a few portions of drywall. Thankfully, I think we stopped the issue in time to where we were able to save pretty much all the drywall. The baseboards did have to go and we had to replace those. But anyways, they proceeded to just rip out the entire basement pretty much, at least most of the basement. There's kind of 2 rooms in this basement. One of the rooms is like our laundry room and furnace area, and the other room is kind of the sort of entertainment living area. The living area, at least the floors, were pretty much destroyed. They then set out these super heavy duty industrial sized dehumidifiers. Then they put a bunch of them throughout the basement to try and suck out all of the water that was in this basement. And it was kind of crazy how much water was coming out of the air just over really an hour. But they left these things at the house for a few days to try and get it as dry as possible to make sure that when we buttoned the basement back up, there wouldn't be any water left behind to cause the same sort of mold threat again. The first step in any water damage problem is to get everything dry. Otherwise, you're just going to cause more damage down the line. A few days later, they came back. Our basement was as dry as the Sahara Desert, and they took the equipment and left. All of that was something like $5,000, and now I'm left with a completely torn up basement. But at least the basement's dry. Now at this point, I didn't actually know what caused the issue. I was thinking that maybe it was storm surge coming in through the top of the window, but it just didn't seem to make a lot of sense because it rained a couple times after that. We didn't have the same problem, and I didn't see any water pooling up near the window, so I didn't really understand what was going on. I decided because of the proximity to the sewer line, it was worth getting it scoped, and that's what we did. And you can see on the scope footage here, there's actually 2 holes, one very big one and a smaller one. And these were both leaching water next to the window. And especially during something like a substantial storm, you're gonna have a lot of water flowing through that pipe and all the excess would be coming out of those 2 holes. And this I thought was going to be very relevant for insurance purposes, but we'll get to that. But at least at this point, I was confident in knowing what the issue was. This is what caused the flood. We had to fix the sewer line. So we brought a plumbing company out, they fixed that, and that was another few $1,000s down the drain. But at least our sewer pipe was fixed. Pro tip, if you know for sure you're gonna be buying a property, especially if it's a pretty old one, this one is from the 1960s, so I didn't really expect it to be that big of an issue, do get a sewer scope done because you never know what you're gonna find. I would have noticed those 2 holes in the pipe if we did do this scope, and then I would have asked for a credit or something to fix them or ask the actual owner, the previous owner, to fix it. I didn't get a sewer scope done, so I didn't actually know that this was a problem until it was too late. And because I'm an investor, I don't call it a mistake that I have to pay money towards. Instead, I call it education that I have to pay tuition towards. So now at this point, we had a dry basement, a fixed sewer pipe, but the basement was still torn up. So that was the final step in getting the basement actually put back together and buttoning it back up. Now the water remediation company put a lot of antimicrobial stuff to stop mold growth and bacteria growth. That is the #1 concern when we're dealing with runoff type water coming into the outside or coming from our sewer pipe at that. And they were able to salvage a lot of the floorboards, but the problem is when they actually ripped many of these floorboards off, they actually broke many of them. They're kind of the snap together type of vinyl planks. So we did have to buy a lot of new planks, and that was a few $100, nothing too crazy compared to the money we had already spent anyways. And we had to patch up some drywall, and we ended up repainting the whole room of the basement that had all the damage. So I actually used the same interior team that I used for my former primary residence. It's now a rental, and we actually had them do like a backsplash over there and painted the whole unit. So I knew they were good and I trusted them and I want to work with them in the future. So I decided to give them this job as well. Oh, and one quick semi-unrelated note, when we actually tore out the drywall, we noticed a pretty substantial foundation crack on the side of the property. It hadn't really caused any issues. It's not as though there was much of water damage or anything like that, but we did notice a foundation crack that we had to epoxy just in case it led to anything in the future. But it was a very old one. It's not as though it was like actively shifting or something like that. But that was another couple $100 to fix. And also as part of the drywall work, we added some supports to the existing drywall beams that were holding up the drywall because the bottom of some of them looked like they'd rotted out at some point, like water had been there before. At some point, there was an old water line leak that was near that area before we actually bought the property, but we had that fixed and there wasn't any obvious damage, but it looks like it did cause some damage, but it wasn't anything catastrophic. It's just the thing holding up some of the drywall, and it was nothing terrible that a simple patch up couldn't fix. But that was that. The basement is all tidied up. I'm actually filming from it right now, so it is totally up and running. I actually bought a dehumidifier, not a big industrial one, but we have one now. I also bought a wet vac, so if we ever run into water issues again, we can actually get a lot more water out of the room before it starts to cause more damage. I don't know, like basements are kind of expensive. And speaking of expense, the whole project, the sewer line, the water remediation, patching the basement back up and getting everything back to normal, essentially just going from stage 0 back to stage 0, that whole project cost us around $11,000 to $12,000. Yeah, that hurts. But not to worry, you might say. Don't you have homeowners insurance? They're gonna pay for this sort of issue, aren't they? Well, let's get to that. While we were doing the remediation work, I was talking with the insurance company about what happened. At first they said, oh no, this is flood damage. You don't have flood insurance, which is a separate thing. There are two different types of insurance generally when it comes to water damage. You have flood insurance and then you have backup insurance. Flood insurance generally deals with things like storm surge or things coming through windows or rainstorms, things that come from the outside and make their way into the property. Backup insurance generally refers to your sump pump and your systems backing up, your drains backing up, things that are more on the man-made side that end up causing problems. And at first I did think this was simply storm surge coming through the window, and I was trying to argue that the sump pump wasn't able to work fast enough, even though everything was working generally. At least that was what I thought at first before I knew about that sewer line. So I was saying, hey, am I covered here? They were saying no, because you don't have flood insurance. I wouldn't even file a claim because it's just gonna get denied. So I listened to them, but I did do my little investigation and found the sewer line holes and was like, hey, this is it. This is a backup issue because it's water actually coming out of the pipes. It's not as though this was just pure runoff coming through the windows or some sort of storm. It was because our sump pump was basically throwing the water back into the unit. That was basically what I was arguing. The insurance claims person was like, I think so. Maybe if you want to file it, go ahead. I'm not too sure, but you might have something there. We'll probably have to have an adjuster come out and take a look. So I went ahead and filed that claim and was thinking, oh, surely I'll get something out of this. Now, the adjuster for an insurance claim is someone who comes by and takes a look at the property and they try to assess the situation and see whether your story holds up, and they're just trying to have some boots on the ground to take a look for the insurance company. My adjuster was a pretty cool guy. We were both baseball fans, so we talked a good bit about baseball, and I made a pretty good impression, right? That could go a long way. But a few days after that, I got back my claim results and they said that I was going to get $0. What? How could this be? Surely I'm owed something. So I called up the claims person that I was talking to before. I said, hey, can I get an explanation here? This is coming from my sewer line for sure. This is totally an issue with the system. It's not an issue with storm surge or what you would consider a flood by any other definition. That conversation didn't really lead to anything. He suggested I reach out to the adjuster team and ask for their explanation. And they basically sent me back a portion of the policy that read that this was part of outside water. Yes, it was part of your system, but it's more of a capital maintenance issue. It's not as though the storm caused the hole in the pipe. It's not as though your sump pump system itself backed up because of the storm or something like that. In this case, it was something that should have been taken care of. That's basically what they were arguing. But in general, they really didn't like the fact that it ultimately was coming from outside. Yes, it went through my sewer system and was pooling up because of that, but it ultimately was coming in through the window, through the dirt. It was outside water, so they really classified it as runoff and thus flood. Had I had flood insurance, I should have been covered under that, but I didn't. After a little bit more back and forth, it didn't really go anywhere, and I was already spending quite a bit of time in this and did not want to spend much more, as yes, we're talking about $10,000, but what's my alternative? I'm gonna file an actual lawsuit against my insurance company and ramp up the expenses that way just to try and collect $10,000 to $12,000 at most. And there's still a very substantial chance that I lose, so is it really worth it? If we're talking about $50,000 worth of damage, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more interesting to try and do something like that. The long story short, I got nothing out of the insurance company.
You just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
So what's the lesson here? Well, for one, insurance companies are not that easy to deal with. And yes, they're trying to serve your needs as a client. They want to keep you happy, but at the same time, they can't pay out claims to everyone because then they would go bankrupt. Because remember, a company is like an enormous clock.
Yeah, Yes, precisely.
This isn't to say that you shouldn't put up a fight with your insurance company, especially if you feel like you're actually owed something, but at the same time, don't file frivolous claims if you're not covered, and do keep in mind that not everything is going to be covered under a general homeowner's insurance policy. If you're not in a flood zone, you're probably not going to need flood insurance, but if you feel like there's a pretty big threat of flood, you're going to need to pay an extra premium for that, so keep that in mind, because typical homeowner's insurance policies, as I've now learned, only come with backup insurance, and that is a pretty limited type of coverage. Of course, check your actual policy. I'm not trying to give you advice because every policy is different and it depends on the language of that specific policy. I'm talking in very general terms. At least in my case, the insurance company decided that I was not covered for something like this. And to that, you want to make sure you can actually weather storms, pun intended, when you deal with anything with real estate, because you never know when something like this is going to happen. You're going to have some major capital expense, and even if insurance does ultimately cover it, you're going to have to pay for a lot of these expenses immediately in many cases. The insurance company might not pay you right away, so in the meantime, you got to pay the contractors, you got to pay the water remediation guys, you got to pay the contractors to come in and do that work. So you always want to have some reserve set aside when we're talking about real estate. When it comes to water damage in particular, do whatever you can to stop the bleeding, essentially. Get things dry so that mold doesn't form and make the problem that much harder to solve. If you notice a leak or some sort of water damage, be sure to call someone right away. Get the remediation done immediately, as quick as you can, because again, the problem only gets worse. One thing I will say about the insurance company, even though they didn't help me out a ton here, they did help with pointing me in the right direction towards a water remediation service, and that was pretty helpful because I didn't have any major context for that. And from there, that water remediation service was able to hook me up with the concrete guy who did that little foundation crack I mentioned, and in general, that was pretty valuable. But do realize that this will probably be a very stressful situation, whether it be because of the dollar amount, the actual fact that stuff is being destroyed, maybe things that you value pretty highly, they're getting water damage. That is not a good thing. It's not fun. Thankfully, a lot of our stuff was actually packed up still, so we were able to move a lot of it very quickly, and a lot of it was relatively water protected. But you might feel like you're being treated unfairly by the insurance company, but it doesn't really do any good to shout at them or get really angry at them. But after all, we're just talking about workers in a company, parts in a clock, if you will. But I guess in my case, being nice to them didn't really get me anywhere either. So do whatever you want to do. All of that said, would I recommend getting your basement flooded? No, don't. Whatever you can, try to prevent the flood from happening in the first place. Do that sewer scope if you're interested in actually buying a property and you're pretty confident you're going to close on it. It is probably worth doing, especially if you uncover something like that, because let's say you shell out $300 to do a sewer scope and that saves you $10,000 in damage once. How many sewer scopes do you have to do before it's not worth it? All it takes is one discovery to save you a lot of time, a lot of headache, and all the great things associated with remediating a damaged basement. So that was my experience. If you guys found this video interesting or you found it valuable, then definitely like it, since that would help the channel out a lot. And if you've had any similar or very different experiences when it comes to water damage or this sort of situation, definitely let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your stories. And be sure to subscribe, since I put out new videos every single week and wouldn't want you guys to miss out. But until next time, take care.